I'm Stephen Johnson, Treasurer. A copy of the accounts has been issued, and there is a glossary attached to it, and copies of the accounts and the glossary on the side table there. And not only Finance Committee, but Council have already reviewed this report in detail, and Council have agreed it. So what I'm trying to do for you this afternoon is just to take you through the report and to help you find your way around it and understand what the report is actually telling us. So, finding your way around the report, it's in 4 sections. First of all, there's a narrative on pages 1 to 20, which is all about the activities of the Society, how, through its charitable objectives, it's benefited the wider public. The second bit is the legal structure, pages 21 to 26, the governance and management of the Society, the approval by Council, by the fellow auditors, and by the audit themselves, the firm we have to audit the report. And finally, the bit in red, which I'm going to take you through, which is the detailed financial information, which comes in the annual report on pages 30 to 46, which are clumps of tables, but 2 basic tables with a number of notes appended to them. So the first table is all about income, and the first part of the first table is about income, and this is telling you exactly what happened in 2014. It comes out in grey on here and comes out in green on the slide. The total funds for 2014 are highlighted in green on the slide. This just gives totals for the income and the expenditure. It doesn't actually show exactly the sources of all that income. On income for the year, note, for example, that donations, grants and bequests this year, the first line under incoming resources, was actually a lot less in 2014 than it had been in 2013. The problem with this line is, of course, that we can never really predict exactly what's going to come in and when it's going to come in. But the work of the Development Office, Dominic in the Development Office, brought in a lot of resources we wouldn't otherwise have had. For example, in that line, there's nearly £10,000 from the Heritage Lottery Fund, which is a catalyst grant. We had to do various things, including run the auction, the Kelmscott auction, earlier in the year. And in that line is also £20,000, which we got in for an artist in residence at Kelmscott. That tapped into the generosity of fellows and others. And there's also funding for picture and research and picture conservation, which also taps into the generosity, not just of external funding bodies, but actually of fellows themselves. Income from Lucerna, which is our trading company at Kelmscott, was actually very buoyant indeed. As you'll see here in that line, in 2014 the total funds from that and from the hire of rooms here was 416,000 or thereabouts, whereas last year that same figure had only been 348,000. So we've actually made great strides in bringing in more money in terms of hiring the rooms here, a little bit in terms of hiring the rooms here, not a vast amount, but actually in terms of Kelmscott, which actually brought in a great deal more. And this is the point at which I think we ought to say how well Kelmscott actually did last year. Trading income from the shop was up by £28,000 last year, which is actually brilliant from Kelmscott, because we have a shop there that sells all sorts of William Morris memorabilia and stuff. And to manage to make sure that shop actually increases its trading income by that amount was brilliant. And last year there were close on 20,000 visitors to Kelmscott, which is very good news indeed, because actually Kelmscott is an absolute gem. We don't want there to be too many visitors to Kelmscott, because that would actually destroy the ethos and the way you feel about the place. But actually 20,000 visitors is pretty good going, considering that the previous year had been very much down on that. I think Sarah Parker, who's the property manager at Kelmscott, is very much to be congratulated, along with her dedicated staff and volunteers, on the work that she's done there and the way in which she's actually made Kelmscott much more viable. And this year is actually also looking towards being much more viable for us, and actually instead of being a drain on the Society's finances, actually making a modest contribution to the Society's finances. And I think that's brilliant news. The hire of our rooms at Burlington House here was up slightly, but nowhere near what we think we ought to be able to achieve in terms of income from the use of these central London facilities, and we are still trying to make strides this year in terms of bringing in more income, but we haven't succeeded in doing that yet. You'll notice that there are 2 columns under income, unrestricted funds and restricted funds. Unrestricted means we can spend it on whatever we like, and restricted funds means we actually have to spend that money on certain things. And the Kelmscott income, the Lucerne income, comes in under restricted funds because it actually is spent on Kelmscott and can't just be spent on anything we wish it to be spent on. Investment income and subscriptions were both up slightly. Investment income, again, split between those parts which we receive from restricted funds and those which are unrestricted. And the publications, we've got a really good link up now on publications with the Cambridge University Press on the Antiquaries Journal, and we received more than £38,000 last year from online digital sales, back sales of the journal, which is really good news, and that's been invested in our bicentenary fund, in our publications fund, in order to fund future publications we might want to do. So the green column shows the income for the year. It's actually, despite being £160,000 less from bequests and donations, that top line, that income figure is only about 60,000 less than last year. So that's pretty good news, because it shows that in other areas we've actually built up our income, and I hope we can continue to maintain the build-up of our income for next year. Expenditure, though, you have to hold on to that you have to hold on to the figure from the last slide, which was about 1.56 million. If you hold on to that 1.56 million, this is how much we spent. And if you look at the bottom line of this, the very bottom line, which is not highlighted in purple, 1.743 million is what we actually spent during the course of the year. So you can see that we're still overspending. I'll take you through this one in a bit more detail, though. There's a lot more information on pages 34 and 35 of the account on how some of this was actually spent. And again, expenditure is split between restricted funds and unrestricted. We do have to spend money to make money. And the cost of sales at the top there is the cost of the development office, the running of Kelmscott trading activities, and managing the room hire at Burlington House. And that's about £270,000 which we spend on those things in order to make more money from some of those, in order to make income from that. Then we've got conservation activity, which is basically our activity at Kelmscott, plus the Morris grants to churches, the care of our own collections, and the conservation of our pictures. On research, that's the costs of running the library, plus the research grants that we make. And on dissemination, that includes the publications programme, the costs of communicating with fellows, and the running of the lecture programmes. So you can see those three big areas, conservation, research, and dissemination, all account for quite a considerable chunk of the funding which we expend. Across the whole thing is governance costs, that we have to make sure that everything is done properly and within a proper framework. And across all of those issues are the costs of providing support costs, which include our finance and admin, our human resources, our health and safety work, and the costs of providing office space here at Burlington House. And one of the things that you need to note from our report for 2013-14 is that our rent went up from nearly £6,000 in 2012-13 to £17,000 in 2013-14. So the cost of our rent at Burlington House is actually, the rent we're being asked to pay is actually going up considerably. And that figure is actually in the text of the report. We are, though, in discussions with our landlords and their agents over our rent and the renewal of the lease, which we need to renew for a further 10 years at the end of this coming January 15. So the bottom line of the chart shows that we've actually spent, against an income of 1.56 million, as I remind you, we've actually spent 1.74 million, i.e. we've spent about £180,000 more than we actually received in during the course of the year. So when you look at this in the profit and loss account overall, this is the slide that actually shows you that. The overall profit and loss account takes that figure, sets it against our overall assets, and the first sentence of the financial review on page 13 gives the result for the year as a deficit of this figure, 183,000. But as was the case last year, the performance of our investment portfolio, which is the blue line, has been relatively good. It isn't as spectacular as it was last year, but it's the blue and purple line, sorry. Was it purple? Yes, it is. it's not as spectacular as it was last year, but the overall result for the year is not a loss, but actually, in terms of a balance sheet, it's a profit because our investments went up by 370,000. So if you look at, we lost, as it were. Sorry, I'm in danger of losing you all. We lost, as it were, 180,000 because we spent 180,000 more than we had, but actually our investments went up by 370,000. So actually, in net terms, we've actually gained 186,949, 187,000, which is the figure in pink, second from the right on the pink line. So that's the net movement. This result includes, obviously, the changes to the value of investments. And if you set this figure aside, you end up with the figure in yellow. So there's the deficit for the year on the top line, and there's the actual profit for the year in the pink line. So the question we always face is this deficit a problem? In part, no, because as I mentioned to those of you who were here last year, it represents a planned use of resources that we've received in previous years. The main one of which still is the colony bequest we received from Raymond Colony's estate some years ago now, in 2010-11, £270,000, which we received and we reported in that year, and this supports the work of the Development Office. So we're gradually spending that £270,000, which came in and was a positive in the accounts in 2010-11, but actually it's being spent year by year and is supporting the work of the Development Office, and therefore is not actually appearing in the credit doesn't appear in the accounts. The credit appeared in the accounts 2 years ago. So that sort of thing is not a problem to us because it's actually planned expenditure. Council also have agreed that we can use some of our capital for specific projects, and we also apply a total returns policy to make sure this is done with relatively low impact on our investments. I.e., if we've got capital funding of around £11 million in the bank, council say, well, why don't we actually release 1%, 1.5% of that in order to do things that we actually want to do? That doesn't show in the accounts because it's an internal transfer between our funds internally. What does show? What it does mean is that the deficit we've actually got is not as bad a deficit because we can actually use some of our restored capital to cover some of those costs. So those are reasons why the deficit isn't a problem, but there are reasons why the deficit is a problem, because we still have to ensure, so far as we can, that we live within our means, so that we want to get to a position where our regular income matches regular expenditure. There will always be different projects and different extras we want to do, but actually our regular income really ought to make sure that we're running our main business with the income that we've got. And Council have also agreed that we should continue to make research and conservation grants, produce some key publications, as well as embrace a new strategic plan, which will take us up to 2020. So we've got to find the resources somehow to do all those things, and that's one of the things which is exercising Finance Committee and exercising Council at the moment. So the deficit is both not a problem, but it is also a problem. We can't go on forever having a deficit of somewhere around £100,000 a year, which is probably what the sort of underlying deficit is. Just on to the balance sheet. This is the consolidated balance sheet. We're still on actually page 2 of the accounts here. This includes Lucerna, the income from Kelmscott, in the group column. So you'll see that there are 2 columns for each year. There's Group and Society for 2013 and Group and Society for 2014. It's a review of the full financial assets of the Society as of 31st of March. First line, under tangible assets, that's things like improvements to buildings, its furnishings, its equipment, and it takes into account the depreciation that has actually been scored against the budget for this year. Under the second line, investments, that includes, and I'll show you a bit more about this on the next slide, but that includes the value of the Kelmscott estate and also includes our investment funds, of which at the end of March last year we had nearly 12 billion. Current assets, that includes Lucerna in the group column, which is the stock at Kelmscott, that's the £72,000. Debtors equals things like gift aid, which we haven't yet received from government, annual subs which we haven't yet received, and some room hire fees still owing. And cash in bank, well, that's fairly obvious that's cash that we actually have that we make sure we actually have a cash flow situation, so we aren't forever actually getting ourselves into debt with Coots and having to draw down more money than we need. But the liabilities, the amounts falling due within 1 year, that's midway down the slide, 548,000 or thereabouts. That includes the VAT that we haven't yet paid, grants agreed but not yet paid out, and a proportion of the subs that we receive in Jan 2014. The fact that we have a financial year that ends in March, end of March, but we actually have subscriptions which are paid on the 1st of January means that we only account for about a quarter of the subs for the first part of the year, and some of it is actually held over in order to be accounted for the second part of the year. So it's a slightly complicated procedure. That's part of the subscriptions we've received, but we haven't actually paid out the benefits on yet. So it's accounting nightmare doing these figures. Working from the bottom then, the pink figure is the net assets and how they're split by the fund. You can see at the bottom we've got permanent endowment funds, restricted capital funds, restricted income funds, and unrestricted funds. The group net assets have improved by the £187,000 as per the profit and loss account, and the blue figure is this year's net liabilities. You see that last year, at this point of the year, we had about £70,000 of net liabilities. This year, much to the auditor's pleasure, we've reduced that to about £9,500 that we still have to pay to people. So that's good news, that we actually aren't carrying a great deal of liability to people. I'll move on to the investments, because this is where we've actually got quite a bit of money sitting in with our investment managers, Saracens. There's no change this year to the valuation of Comscott. You can see it's 1.918 or 1.919 million. The investments are split between these four types: the permanent endowment, restricted capital, restricted income, and unrestricted. And all our investments, the middle block of money, that's the 11.974369 is the figure that it was at the 31st of March. That money is actually handled for us by Saracens, our investment managers, and put into their Alpha Common Investment Funds. 90% of that is into their endowment fund and 10% is in their income and reserves fund, and that produces for us about a 4%, somewhere around a 4% income stream, which has actually been counted already in what you've seen under income. So at the end of the day, the market value of the society at the bottom line is nearly 14 million, 13.893 million is at the end of the year. Net current assets, now why doesn't all of that come up together? Let's see what's going to come up. This is one of the reasons why people think we're a rich society, because what we have is permanent endowment funds, which actually have to be spent on specific purposes, where we can't convert the capital to income unless approved by charity commissioners. Restricted capital funds are things which the council themselves have actually said these funds are being set aside for particular purposes. For example, one of them is a fund for works to Burlington House. Now, the council could decide to spend the capital of that fund as well as the income from that fund, but they've actually chosen to make it into a restricted capital fund. And the restricted income fund is the income from the permanent endowment funds, which hasn't yet been used. But the unrestricted funds are the general purposes funds that we can use on anything. So we've actually got 5.8 million in those funds, and that's why people think we're actually really well off. But actually, when you look at what we can actually use and what are parts of our long-term investments, the only bit that we can actually use out of those funds are the free reserves, if you like, is 329,468. It's the purpley blue figure. That's why we don't actually have as much money as people think we have. And the majority of our figure that we've actually got in those investments is long-term investments, invested funds set aside to generate income for future years. And if we start liquidating that, we compromise the society's long-term future. Roughly £1 million of investments generate somewhere between £40,000 and £50,000 worth of income every year. So if we spend £1 million now, we actually jeopardise future income by about £40,000 to £50,000. So the purple box represents funds we can access, and about half of that is cash, which will pay for some of our commitments and also to cover planned expenditure. So it's a significantly smaller figure than the 5.8 million that we actually think we might have as free reserves. It's not the free reserves. The free reserves is only the 329,000. So I hope that hasn't mystified you too much, and that kind of gives you an overview of where the society stands in terms of its finances. It's relatively healthy. We do have investments of nearly £12 million, which many charities can't say, and I think actually being in that position is very healthy indeed. But we've still got to make sure, and our finance committee and I as treasurer, we've all got to make sure that we do use those resources well in a proper manner, and actually towards furthering the purposes of the society. Final slide. Our auditor's opinion, they've given us an absolutely clean bill of health, as they did last year. They have nothing to report in respect of the following matters. The information given in the annual report is not inconsistent in any material respects with the financial statements. We have kept sufficient accounting records. The financial statements are in agreement with the accounting records, and they've received all the information and explanations they require. So they are completely happy with us, and it's to the credit of Leslie Fallagher, who's sitting here in the front row, who has been our financial manager for many years, that we do have such a clean bill of health and such a good set of accounts to present to you and, of course, to the charity commissioners. Thank you.